This lecture is called Bayesian Phylogenetic Linguistics, and I'm joined by my two co-teachers, Nataliia Hübler and Olena Shcherbakova. So all of us are linguists, but we have different interests. And Nataliia is interested in the evolutionary dynamics of language structure. She has a BA in German Studies from the Kiev National Linguistic University and an MA in Phonetics and Language Typology from the University of Kiel. She's now a doctoral student or doctoral researcher at the Department of Linguistic and Cultural Evolution at the MPI. She started as a Gramberg coder and still enjoys reading grammars. So we have a lot of people in our department who love to read grammars, and she's one of them. In her research, she focuses on the history of languages of Northern Eurasia by applying phylogenetic methods and population models. My second co-teacher of the day is Olena Shcherbakova. She's also a linguist, of course, and she is interested in language evolution and sociolinguistics. She received her BA and MA in philology. That's a word I never will be able to pronounce, from the National Technical University of the Ukraine. Currently, she is a PhD student in the Department of Linguistic and Cultural Evolution. Her work centers on uncovering the causal links behind typological patterns and testing hypotheses connecting language and social structures on a cross-linguistic scale. Most of you by now know me already, so I will make my introduction really quick. So I'm Annika Tjuka. I'm a doctoral researcher at the Department of Linguistic and Cultural Evolution, and I completed my master's degree in linguistics at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where I specialized in psycholinguistics and typology. I'm very interested in the diversity of language variation in word meanings. And I just put together a database which combines data from psychology and linguistics. That's for the introduction part. So now I'm switching back to my to the screen, and yes, we'll begin with our lecture on Bayesian phylogenetic linguistics. To give you a broad overview of what we are going to talk about today, so I will give you a short introduction. We have basically broke down the whole lecture into three parts, each of which are about 20 minutes. So you will first hear a broad introduction into Bayesian phylogenetics methods. I will give you also some insights into the input data that we put into those models. And then Nataliia is going to take over and we'll talk about trees, networks, and admixture analysis. And then Olena will round up the whole presentation with phylogenetic comparative methods and tell you about what, why, and how, and about a toolkit and some case studies. So we will take you on a wild ride, I would say. It's a 1-hour class. You will never be able to get the whole, all the details, all the mathematical basis, as well as the all the different case studies that you can look up in this short amount of time. But we try to give you a very good summary of the things that we think are important to take from those methods and to do with those methods as well. So if you, after the lecture, would like to go into the nitty-gritty detail, we have a lot of experts in our department and at the university in Jena that you can ask further questions. So we will refer you to anyone that we think can answer your question, but we are also, of course, wanting to give you an idea of the conceptual idea behind why we use those methods in our department. So I'm going to talk about the goal, the lexical structural data, which you already heard about in this summer school, then the quantitative approaches, and a general overview about Bayesian phylogenetic methods. But first, I would like to do a quick poll because I don't know how the knowledge level in our very diverse group is. Okay, so none of you have used Bayesian phylogenetic linguistics, which is totally for linguistic data, sorry, which is totally fine. That's why we are here. That's why we wanted to do this class in general, because I think it's not something that you will have a lot of courses within university, usually in Germany. I don't know how it is in other places, but we have at least a few people that already use Bayesian phylogenetic methods for other types of data. And I think it's good to know that these methods can be applied to a wide range of data, and linguistics or language data is only one example. So yeah, thank you very much for participating. And then we can go on. In general, summarizing the goal, and by now you should know, so we want to group languages, and we want to date languages, and we want to categorize languages into subgroups. You have already heard some of the examples where we categorize languages into certain groups. And then we also would like to do a phylogeny, so tracing the history of a language family. And then a third goal is chronology, so defining the date of the origin of a language family. This is some of the results that we did in our first day of the week. So this was the result of the basic vocabulary task, where I ask you what is the basic vocabulary that you think is basically comparable across the world and across all languages. And here are some examples. I also showed you then the very famous Swadesh list that is quite frequently used. Martin yesterday talked about the Lexical list. This is also a very famous list, and it's also often used. So you have different types of lists, and you might find very all sorts of adaptations and changes in those lists. But this is one of the most famous one. So we talk a lot about lexical data. And I myself also, like, I talk about the lexicon, although I know that it's only basic vocabulary. So it's a very, very small proportion of the whole language, right? 100 words of a language is like a very, very small amount. And what we also need to keep in mind that we actually should talk about cognitive data. So that's the input that we put into all of our models. We use the lexical data, we have those lists, but the lexemes need to be assigned to cognate sets. So basically, you have the lexemes across languages, across a set of languages of a given family. And then you judge whether or not, and Rasmus referred to that in his talk, like in what box, and you want this cognate box basically. And these cognate judgments are based on the comparative method and are already, what you need to keep in mind is that you don't pick languages at random, but you already have a set of languages that are established to be in one language family. So if you want to make a Bayesian phylogenetic analysis, you need to know that these languages belong to the same family based on the comparative method, and then you can work with them. And the input for all the analysis is not the list of lexemes, so it's not like sand and heart or arm that you put into your models, but you put zeros and ones. You work with a computer, so that's what the input of for a computer model needs to look like. So that basically represents the cognicy relationship. And then we also talked about structural data. Hedwig talked about this in her typological overview. And so these are phonological or morphological features. These can be something like whether or not a language has a tone system, distinction of gender and third-person pronouns, or the absence or presence. And then the absence or the presence of the feature is coded as 0 and 1. So does the language have 2 or more contrastive tones? Yes, then it gets a 1, 0 if it's not there. And then you need to know that grammatical features are often linked. So they can also change simultaneously. This is something that you also will find if you do like a comparative method analysis of how languages are grouped together or how languages are put into trace back the history of a language family. And some features are more stable than others. I would like to refer you to the first article by Simon Greenhill. This lecture will have a lot of articles by Simon. He is one of our Bayesian methods wizard in our department. So if you ever have a question that nobody can answer, Simon is the person who you should go to. And then, as Hedwig already introduced you to, so we are now within our department working on this Gramberg, which right now includes about 200 structural features of 2,000 languages, and they're all based on reference grammars. And also, I'm not sure if you already found that, but I put in the Gramberg wiki page where you can see the list of all the features and can look at also the annotation protocol that was established within this project. So also a question of why I'm here and telling you about all these fancy analyses is we are now, and this is a huge claim, but we are in the age of a biggish data age. So we receive or we can access linguistic data more freely. It's more openly accessible, which is super great, but it also gives us the challenge of that not a single person can process all the data. And that's what historically has been done, right? We had a lot of experts that were working on a certain language family, but now this data becomes so big that we need some assistance. And the tools that we develop within our departments are computational based. So we first, I introduced you to Mathis List, who's working on computational tools for historical linguists that can then do their analysis and their annotation in a more standardized way. And of course, with these Bayesian phylogenetic methods, you also have like a computational modeling that you use to process all the data. And if you, and some of you are a geneticist or biologist, I think they always smile when I tell them, oh, this is so much data, because they have been working with a lot more data. So these methods also originate in evolutionary biology, and I will get to that. But first, this is a very brief overview of the history of quantitative approaches in linguistics. Definitely not exhaustive, but still some key terms that you will find throughout the literature. So we heard about lexical statistics for subgrouping. There was a tool actually established or applied first by Swadesh. And there you look at the degree of relationship between two languages, which is based on the number of shared cognates. And then we have also an older method called glottochronology. And we talked about this in the chat. And I also referred to this introduction article by Simon. This method is used or was used for dating the time that lies between the separation of two languages can be measured by the degree of their similarity and a constant clock rate. You will hear throughout the lecture and mostly in Natalia's talk about clocks. So this is basically time as a clock, right? Everybody knows what a clock is, but you have time steps, so to say. In general, these both approaches were rejected. I think there is still a lot of discussion around quantitative approaches within historical linguistics in general. There is some skepticism, there is some definitely valid criticism also about these methods. But in the case of those two methods, the main claim was, or the main problem was that languages vary in their rate of change. So we cannot say that a language changes like every 10 years or something like this. That's not possible, and every language changes differently. So this was a huge obstacle for those two methods. And that's why we turn to science, to biology. Biologists face similar problems. So if you remember back from my introduction lecture, I talked about Darwin. So they wanted to like develop methods that account for the variation of rates. So in species, so how do species vary and in what rates? And those Bayesian phylogenetic methods come from evolutionary biology, and they try to make up for the shortcomings in the old approaches, so the ones that I told you before, and have been applied right now, especially in the last 20 years, I would say, in many, many different studies. And as I said, you will hear a lot of them. We actually put together 3 slides of further readings where you can look out for more studies. So yeah, and also something that I think is important, those methods are not meant to substitute any of the historical linguists' work. They are a supplement to the comparative method, and we work together with historical linguists in our department. Although, of course, there are always some disagreements, but still, this is something that I think is important to keep in the back of your head, that this is a quantitative approach to how languages can, or language history in general. I talked to you about, so this is, in no way I will be able to give you a mathematical foundation today, not in this short amount of time and not with my background. I'm a linguist. I like math, but I have never studied mathematics, but I do my best, and for me at least, it's good to conceptualize what's happening so that I know what methods do in the end, basically. So we talked about that those probabilities, if you see a sequence, so we had marbles, but you now can replace basically the marbles of white and blue with 0 and 1. So you have a sequence that you observe, a cognate judgment basically, and you can get there in many different ways, right? So what those Bayesian phylogenetics methods do, they test which set of trees best fit the data based on the model. So you put in the data, and the data is usually lexical data or structural data. And then you find the most probable trees. And I would really like to stress this one, because I didn't know that when I read my first Bayesian phylogenetic article where they talked about the structure of the Austronesian language family. I thought this is one tree, basically. That's the tree, but it's actually not. Behind that are many probable trees. So you will see density trees, which I think is a much better representation. Usually you will find like trees where you have single lines, and then you have those probabilities in small numbers at each branch, and you need to be like zoom in on the article. So if you see something like this is a consensus tree, then basically this is put together nicely visual of the most probable trees. But keep in mind, this is not a single one. The mathematical basis of all the Bayesian phylogenetic methods is the Bayes theorem. If you would like to know more about that, I would also like to refer to Richard McArath Statistical Rethinking course, where he really gives a very good introduction into the basic into the mathematical basis. The two key terms that you need to remember is the posterior distribution, which is basically here the probability of A given B, if it's true. And then we have the prior, which is also will be, I will show you that in a minute or in a second. Okay, so this is an overview what Nataliia also is going to talk about. So just to give you a step-by-step Bayesian phylogenetic analysis. So we have our lexical data that we already discussed, and we code them. So we do the cognate judgment, and for that you need the experts. And each language gets this type of 001 or 100. And then you put in the prior information, and the prior information is usually something, for example, that you already know. So for example, if you have certain constraints, or you also have at least certain historical phenomenon, you could put that in the model. And you can also variate and test which set of priors works best for the model, and also like you have all these different parameters that you can work out. And then you select the model. You always you don't choose like a model at random, right? You need to look at the data which makes the most sense, but you can also test the validity of the models. There's also, I think, at least one paper where they test different models for the same research question to see what works best. And this is commonly also done in psychology, where you have general linear mixed models, and then you test and evaluate which is the best model fit as it is then said in the final article. And then you do this cool Markov chain Monte Carlo, which basically looks at different types of trees that you can like get from your data. As I said, there is a lot of math behind it. So yeah, I will refer to I will refer you to the people who know how to explain that better than I do. But what you will then get in the end is a posterior distribution of the tree. So here you see very thin black lines. This is basically everything. Each of those lines is a probable tree, or the most and then you have like the thicker black lines that is the one that is most probable, because there is more lines going the same way. So this is a density tree, what we are also going to see in the examples. And then there are different types of evolutionary questions. So all of you work in different areas, and different, you also work on different questions. So you can use Bayesian phylogenetic comparative methods. And I would like to highlight this article by Fiona Jordan, which is on kinship terms, but it also gives a very good overview on those methods. And this graph, I really wanted to show you that graph, because you see the different applications of those methods. you see the different questions that you can ask, and then use those methods, and then get here their examples. And you might see this one is a very good example of lexical and typological features. So putting the two together, we often find only trees that are based either on lexical data or structural data. So this is one example where they have put together lexical and or they look at lexical and typological features. Yes, and with that, I would like to hand over the floor to Nataliia.
We will use two case studies with two different types of data. So the study on the Dravidian languages based on basic vocabulary, and the study of languages of Australia and Oceania using typological data. We will see how one can use networks, trees, and then mixture plots to get a better idea of the genealogical and areal variation in these data sets. We will start by preparing the data, then go on with setting up the analysis by setting the priors and the model parameters, and then see what happens when we run the analysis. So we will get behind the scenes of the Markov chain Monte Carlo. We will discuss what the resulting phylogeny includes and what inferences we can make about the history of the language family. And we will discuss what a neighbor net is, when we normally use it, and what we can learn from it. We'll also see how a mixture analysis can be used in linguistics and how it complements the other methods. Depending on what our goal, depending on which data we have and what our hypothesis is, we can give preference to one tool or another. If we have solid cognate coded data and an idea about the relationships between the languages, say we have applied the comparative method to establish the language family, but we don't know yet when the branches of the tree split off and how old the language family is, then Bayesian phylogenetic methods are our best choice. If we gathered some data, but we don't really know what the relationships between the languages are, or if our data is suited for building trees or not, well, if it's rather not suited like the typological data, then we should have a closer look at the neighbor net first. If we know about intensive contact between the languages, or we have collected data for some seemingly or really unrelated languages, but we want to explore the pattern of contact and eventually find some deep links between languages, then we can turn to the mixture analysis. It enjoys quite some popularity in population genetics. We will skip the basic vocabulary because we already talked extensively about it, and go on with collecting structural features. So we've heard a lot about them during the presentation by Hedvig Skigård on Tuesday, and here is only a small recap and a coding example. So the best data source is a glossed example. It is framework free, and it allows the linguist to better decide whether a particular item corresponds to a particular comparative concept. From a single example, we can already learn a lot about language and can answer at least 5 questions. We would not for sure code all of these as zeros and ones, but by judging by just one example, but it still provides evidence that particular phenomena are possible in the language. The formulations deviate from those in Gramberg, but the idea is approximately the same. So we see that if we see that the verb, in this case give, stands at the end of the sentence, then the feature on the word order gets a 1. So is it the verb at the end of the sentence? Yes. And do we see on the noun whom it belongs to? In this case, father, my. There is this small my suffix on the word father. Therefore, this feature would also get 1. Does the numeral come before the noun? We see 5 female deer, so 5 goes before the deer, therefore it also gets 1. Do we see on the verb who performed the action? In this case, it is third person singular, that refers to the father. So yeah, we see a link between the father and give, and this feature also gets a 1. Are there cases for nouns and for pronouns? At least we see here the dative and the accusative markers. So yes, the core cases and oblique cases can be marked on nouns. Now let's have some fun and code the feature on the position of the verb in the sentence together and make a topology ourselves. So if you speak multiple languages, go with a language with a smaller number of speakers, so that we get a less biased sample of the language diversity. And here we should have a poll. So we see that worldwide there is an approximately equal distribution of languages with SOV, and SVO word order. So where the verb is at the end and the verb is in the middle of the sentence. In our small sample, we had the majority of people having the SVO word order, like with the verb on the second in the middle of the sentence. So the most Central European languages end up in this lesser group of SVO languages with only some minor deviations. So the other word orders, like the verb subject object, are pretty rare. You can explore more features and more languages which have different word orders on walls. Here is the link. When coding basic vocabulary, we can choose, depending on the task, a multi-state or binary coding. When using binary coding, you may end up with 1,000 of lists, depending on how many cognate sets there are per basic vocabulary item. Obviously, multi-state coding takes less space, and you have only one list with 100 or 200 items coded for the number of the languages you have. As for structural features, the first matrix is definitely more common, since most features are binary. There is a set of programs you will need to prepare, run the analysis, use the links to browse through the programs, and some are for preparing the analysis, some for running it, and some for interpreting the results. Both for trees and networks, you need to transform your data into a Nexus file. Here we see how it looks. Number of taxa means the number of languages you have, and number of characters are, in our case, the structural features, so the number of the structural features you have. They are then the list of the languages follows, followed by a string of zeros and ones. For Bayesian tree building, you need the combination of the beauty and the beast. Here's the beauty, here's the beast. So first you set up everything in beast, and then you run in beauty, and then you run the beast. In beauty, you set up all the model parameters, and it generates an XML file for you. The XML file is the input format you need to start the beast. I expect some of this to be covered also in the phylogenetics workshop on Wednesday next week. Well, one of the advantages of using Bayesian modeling is the possibility to incorporate your prior beliefs into the calculation of the probability. If you know that some languages split off at a particular time, this is your chance to include it in the analysis. If you are not interested in the internal structure, but rather want dates, you can put monophyletic constraints on some of the branches to make all languages go into the same higher level branch. This will make the model less complex and let it converge easier and faster. Note that you obviously cannot derive conclusions on the internal structure if you put monophyletic constraints on the branches. Keep in mind that the model should learn from the data. The general rule from statistics is too many model parameters lead to poor predictions. There is a simple way to check whether your model is learning from the data. You should run the analysis with and without data. Just check or uncheck the sample from the prior button in the in beauty. So the takeaway is more is not better. You can choose between several models of character change. The continuous the continuous time Markov chain follows the principle one rate to rule them all. That is, cognates are gained and lost at the same rate. The covariant model allows each cognate set to remain relatively stable over time, but occasionally switch to a faster rate category. The stochastic dollar model allows cognates to appear once on a tree, but get lost multiple times. But there are like new models are developed all the time, and they are also adapted to language data. But you don't necessarily find documentation for applying those models to language data, sadly. We'll skip that for now. The gamma rate heterogeneity is a very common way to handle rate variation, especially in the continuous time Markov chain model. Simply put, this gives each side, usually cognate, a rate sample from a gamma distribution. So those are gamma distributions with different alpha parameters, which is the shape parameter. Ask your nearest mathematician for details on this. For practical reasons, this distribution is usually chopped into 4 sections, that is gamma is equal 4, as this slows down the analysis. For gamma is 5 times slower. Strict clocks, there are also 2 clock models between which you can choose. So depending on the data set, if you have a really small data set, it makes no sense to go with the relaxed clock. So if you should always run like the analysis with different models and then compare their performance. But you can expect the strict clock to perform better if you have a very small data set, like only 15 languages. But normally relaxed clock is a better fit to language data. Strict clock assumes that languages evolve at the same rate and allows no variation over time. This is kind of similar to glottochronology. Relaxed clock allows branches to evolve at different rates, so Icelandic can evolve as slowly as it wants. This is a solution to the problems of glottochronology. Now that we are all set up, it's time to start the search for the densest forest. The number of languages and the number of possible trees don't have a linear relationship. So for just 5 languages, there are in theory 105 ways in subgrouping them in a rooted tree. And then the numbers grow like to millions and millions of trees. So no human is capable of analyzing such masses of data. We need a machine to do that work for us. BEAST uses the algorithm, the so-called Markov chain Monte Carlo. Its aim is to find the set of trees that best fit the data given the model. The search for that set of trees starts at a random point, like somewhere in this bush, in these bushes. That's why it's good to run. That's why it's also good to run it several times, so that we let it start at different parts of the space and different points in space, and then it goes to another point, evaluates it, like, is this tree more popular than this one? If it gets a yes, then it looks further until it and then it decides whether to move to or not, and it moves to another tree, and then it starts all over again. So our robot is walking from one tree to another until it at some point reaches 2 probable tree sets, and then it just keeps moving between them. This is called stationarity. The very beginning of the search is called the burn-in and is removed from the further analysis. I guess that's what some student in the chat meant, that it's rather about finding the trees that are bad rather than finding the set of good trees. The set of the most probable trees is called the posterior distribution. This is the chain as we see it in Tracer. We can see in the plot the exact point when the robot finally found the set of most probable trees, and now it kept just going from between those 2 sets. We can chop off the burn-in where we have and leave only the part where we have reached stationarity. In our settings in duty, we can set the chain length. That is how long we want our robot to look for trees. If it is too short, we might not reach conversions. We can analyze the output in Tracer to see whether we have run the analysis for long enough and whether all the parameters stabilized. If we see the plot like above, it means that that particular parameter hasn't reached stationarity, and we either have to increase its weight in the XML file so that the robot spends more time on this parameter, or run the whole analysis for longer. But this is a nice chain. That is a nice, well-behaved chain, so everything is fine if you see the plot like that. Now we come to the now that we have come to the last step, interpreting the results, we start with a short introduction to our exemplary language family, the Dravidian language family. It consists of around 80 varieties, and its languages are spoken in India, Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, in all by over 2 million speakers. Languages with the most language speakers are marked in bold on the map. It is relatively small in terms of the number of languages, but it played an important role in the history due to its contact with Indo-European and Austroasiatic language families. So we can learn more about those two language families if we learn more about Dravidian languages. The speakers of this family might have been more scattered across Asia and lived not as compact as they live today. But neither geographical origin nor the exact dispersal through time are known. And this is where Bayesian tree building comes into play. The researchers tested 12 models, and the covariant relaxed log model with word traits turned out to be the best. So the trees in this presentation represent the results of this model, or rather the combination of the models. We remember from before that what we get is not a single tree, but rather a whole forest. This is best visible in the density tree representation, where we see all the trees from the posterior distribution layered up on top of each other. If we go with the root channel option in density tree, a line is drawn on top of the trees, making it easier for humans to read. The maximum lake readability tree is kind of a summary of all the trees we've just seen. The layers are now represented by numbers. The more often a particular branch appears in the density tree, the higher is the posterior probability in the maximum lake readability tree. We see that branches with monophyletic constraints, like the one here, the one over here, and the one over here, have a posterior probability of 1, because we said from the very beginning that we know that those languages go together. So the model is very sure of that too. Contemporary languages of the Dravidian language family are on the right. As in the density tree, the x-axis corresponds to time given in years before present, whereas 2000 is normally assumed to be the present, and branch lengths also correspond to time. The bars on the nodes reflect the uncertainty about around the age. So if we go back to tracer, where we analyze our chain, we see that the root age visible as the tree height parameter is not a point, but it's rather a distribution. So we know that the age is somewhere in this range, with the values over here being more probable. A nice fact is that in this particular study, only one model showed another root age. So more or less, all of the models suggest the root age of 4,000 till 4,500 BP. So what do we do if the tree model is a poor fit to our data? Even though there are tree models that take horizontal gene transfer, in our case borrowing, into account, they do not have linguists uncover borrowing or deliver an estimate for the borrowing frequency. One of the alternatives includes neighbor joining. So it is a distance-based method for constructing phylogenetic networks, and the sizes of the boxes here, boxes everywhere, corresponds to conflicting signal between the languages. So the resulting graph provides a useful visualization to the extent to which the data is tree-like. In this particular neighbor net of the Dravidian languages, we see a high amount of conflicting signal in Tulu and Telugu. We see big boxes here and big boxes there. There is also a way to measure the degree to which the language is involved in conflicting signal. That is the delta and the Q residual scores. The higher the scores, the more conflicting signal there is, and the less tree-like the data is. The scores for Tulu and Telugu lie, as we see here, lie above the overall delta score, and they pull it probably higher, like for the overall tree. So if we compare the delta and Q residual scores across language families, we see that Indo-European language family has relatively low delta and Q residual scores, whereas Polynesian languages, the scores for them are relatively high. Why is it like that? There are several tentative explanations for the tree likeness of the data. First is the amount of borrowing, which appears due to language contact. Then the nature of the development, like the dialect chain breakups produce more conflicting signal. The speed at which the language spreads over the territory, like in case of the Pacific, the spread was rather rapid. The age of the language family, the older the language family is, the more tree-like it looks, and the noise in the data can also lead to high scores. Now there is another alternative to Bayesian tree building, the mixture model with incorporated in the software structure. It is very admired among population geneticists, and yeah, first we decide on how many language families are probable given the language sample, and we compare the probability of each number of language families, that is k in this case, after running the model, and choose how many language families we want to accept. The model assigns language to one or several language families, and yeah, and so the positive effect is that we see the never mind, a bit running out of time. It allows for a higher level of admixture between languages, so it doesn't assign language strictly to one family. Therefore, it is ideal for structural features, and that's why I explore my data with it too. There is only one up-to-date study applying this model language data, that is to typological features coded for languages of the former Sahul continent. Linguists have long hypothesized ancient connections between the language of Australia and New Guinea and surrounding islands, which cannot be spotted by the comparative method. Remember, its time constraints. But these connections have never been for the first time they were demonstrated in this study. So the plot on the left demonstrate the probabilities of different Ks, that is the assumed number of language families. There are some heuristic and computational methods to decide which K is best, but we cannot go into them. They went with a K of 10. The resulting plot, yeah, the original plot. So it's just on a snapshot of the original plot. The original plot is huge because there are so many language families in there. Their results support the division to 10 populations, some of which align well with known language families and some of which have not yet been proposed. We have seen the structures especially well suited for analyzing structural data. It allows linguists to verify existing language families, also to detect language contact events and substratum in case of population replacement and language shift. But there is an obvious drawback, though. Your results depend heavily on the languages you include. Obviously, if you cannot, you cannot spot the influence of French and English if French is not in your sample. So the model will find a solution for you, but you wouldn't be able to trust that model in anymore. The takeaway from this part is that Bayesian tree building methods do not replace the comparative method, they rather build up on it, but they do offer an alternative for grotoconology with the relaxed block model, whereas you need a data set of decent size, say more than just 20 cognate sets for the Bayesian analysis. You are well equipped for using NeighborNet and running structure with as many as just 14 features. These methods also work well at high or unknown levels of borrowing and do not have requirements on the established relationships between languages. And this is an activity I would like you to kind of take with you, either to the chat or the question and answer session or to the informal session on Gather Town. So what do you think of the language data? Is it justified to apply methods from genetics to our data? Now I hand the floor over to Lena.
Right, so thank you. So let's continue talking about phylogenetic comparative methods. So I'm going to walk you through what these are, what are their benefits, or why we should be using them, and how to apply them. I'll also include some of the case studies that use these comparative methods and apply them to learn more about the evolution of linguistic and cultural systems. Right, so what are phylogenetic methods? In fact, you already know quite a lot about phylogenetic methods because Annika and Nataliia told you a lot about how to construct and how to analyze trees. Now, I am going to talk predominantly about how we can incorporate phylogenies in our analysis and why we should be doing that. What you need to know about phylogenetic comparative methods is that they rely on the synergy between synchrony and diachrony. So why is synchronic aspect so prominent? Because primarily we're interested in the languages and cultures that exist nowadays that are scattered around the world. But at the same time, diachronic aspect also plays a huge role because we're using a phylogeny, and a phylogeny is the representation of the descent relationships of languages and cultures that are related to each other. So we cannot really learn much about synchronic variation without accounting for those descent relationships that exist between related languages and cultures. And this brings me to the first reason for using phylogenetic information in the analysis. Namely, it's very important to control for common ancestry, or you could also say to control for shared inheritance or genealogical relatedness. Those are the same things, and they all boil down to just one idea. We need to make sure that languages that are related by descent are not treated as if they were independent. And if those languages belong to the same family, they by definition are not independent. Now, if you do not believe me and think that it's not important to control for those relationships, take a look at Draco Malfoy here. Now, he's usually not the best role model, and in this scene, he's been quite mean to Ron, but what he does manage to recognize successfully is that red hair doesn't cause poverty and poverty doesn't cause red hair. In fact, the reason why Ron and all of his siblings have both red hair and not the best economic position is that those were inherited from their parents to the children, Ron and his siblings. And if Draco Malfoy recognizes those kinds of relationships, I think we all should too. Now I'm going to introduce you to some of the alternatives to phylogenetic comparative methods to see which limitations they pose and why, if we have the choice between phylogenetic comparative methods and another methods, the former should be preferred. So we cannot really use standard correlational methods to address the questions about large-scale linguistic or cultural patterns, primarily because those languages that will be part of the sample, they will not all be independent. In fact, if we ignore this and just continue with standard correlational methods, we'll end up violating an important assumption of independence of observations. This means we will treat languages like Spanish and Portuguese in the same way we would treat languages like Spanish and Chinese. So two very closely related languages and two languages from different families. And this would be a mistake. Now, in order to overcome that, there was an attempt of including the sampling technique and going with standard correlational methods. So sampling languages, taking just one or two languages from different families and trying to make sure that they are sparsed geographically in a sensible way, people hoped to make sure that the samples would then be consisting of languages that are independent. But there are two important problems with this approach. Firstly, we end up going from potentially lots and lots of data points to just a limited number of data points. So we are losing a lot of languages or societies that we could run the analysis on. And even despite that huge sacrifice that we're making, we still get no promise that the final sample will include only entirely independent languages or societies. And this will lead to a biased sample that inaccurately reflects the reality. And then if we go to those standard correlational methods, on a biased sample, we may end up discovering correlations that are not actually there, or we might fail seeing real interrelationships between traits which are concealed by this biased nature of the sample. Now, another alternative is trying to fit models with random effects of language families. So this is still an improvement compared to these two other techniques. So this allows us to recognize that Spanish and Portuguese should belong to one group, Chinese and other Sino-Tibetan languages should belong to another group, Uralic languages should be also a separate group. But the limitation of this approach is that the relationships within the specific families are simplified. This means that within this method, you won't be able to see the difference between closely connected languages, closely related languages, such as Spanish and Portuguese, and languages that belong to the same family, but are slightly more distantly related, such as Spanish and Russian. So I hope that considering these limitations, you realize that, again, if we have the choice, we should still be opting for phylogenetic comparative methods. Now, another set of reasons for incorporating phylogenetic information from trees into our analysis includes the following ones. We are empowered to statistically assess a range of models that we fit. We can test several competing hypotheses. We can examine the correlation in the evolution of traits. And crucially, we get to determine the direction of causal relationships in the traits that we are interested in. So if you observe the synchronic distribution of traits of interest, you can often make inferences about what's rare, what's common, which combinations occur in which parts of the world. But what you cannot do is understanding what were those exact diachronic processes that led to this current synchronic distribution of traits. And this is where phylogenetic comparative methods come to rescue and help you to filter out the diachronic processes that were unlikely or very rare and identify the actual diachronic processes that were responsible for what we see now in contemporaneous languages and societies. To make this a bit more explicit, phylogenetic methods allow us to go beyond the numbers and establish or uncover the causal relationships behind those distributions. So if we know, for instance, that it's common to see two traits in languages or in cultures, with phylogenetic methods, we can see why it is the case. We can, for instance, discover that when there is one trait, it's very likely that it will gain also this X trait. Or this could be mutual and this could be not mutual, but this is this competitive advantage of phylogenetic comparative methods that you can really dive into this and discover which diachronic processes were real, which were responsible for what we see now, and what was rather unlikely. So now that we know why it's important to use phylogenetic comparative methods, let's see how exactly we can apply this. So obviously, we need to have a phylogeny available, we need to have our data of interest, and it's also important that we make a good informed choice out of the whole toolkit of methods and apply the method that fits our data and the specific research question that we're interested in. And then this is where the fun begins. You can ask bold, interesting questions about the history of languages and cultures around the world and test the hypotheses. And again, the magic of phylogenetic comparative methods is in taking data of languages and cultures that exist now and getting a glimpse into the past, seeing how exactly we got here where we are now and what kinds of changes happened through time. Important technical step before running the analysis is making sure that we get an exact match between our tree and our data. This means that we get rid of data points when there is no matching language or society on our tree. And this also means that we need to prune the tree to match the data. Or in other words, we are getting rid of the languages for which we do not have data, for which we do not have information we're interested in. And then we end up with a smaller tree but which still respects and preserves the initial hierarchical relationships between languages. Also, a small disclaimer, you wouldn't usually run an analysis on a tree that's so little and so tiny. I'm just showing you this as a way to illustrate how we go from a slightly larger tree to a smaller one, but that fits perfectly to the data we have. So I'm going to be returning to this trait, illustrating political complexity at least 2 more times today. So for now, it's just good to know that different societies can have different levels of political complexity that range from very simple ones to more complex ones, even more complex ones, and the maximally politically complex societies, such as large states. So just keep that in mind for today. Now, today, I'm going to introduce you to a range of methods that are implemented in Bayes trait software that allows us to analyze 1 or 2 variables. And also I'll briefly introduce you to the phylopath analysis with which we can compare several causal models and include multiple variables of different types. So as far as Bayes traits is concerned, your choice of the precise method should be based on the kind of data you have and the precise research question that you are pursuing. Let's explore the multi-state method first. And here again, we have our political complexity. So in this first case study that we'll focus on, we're looking at the evolution of political complexity in Austronesian-speaking societies. And this is where that competitive advantage of phylogenetic comparative methods comes into light, whereby we see which diachronic processes were happening and which diachronic processes were unlikely. So we see that we can go from a very simple simple political society to one step further to a more complex one or even higher complex level. We can also lose political complexity step by step or more rapidly, going from extremely complex society to a much more simple society. What is impossible, however, what phylogenetic methods reveal, are the jumps from very simple societies to much more complex ones. Now let's look at another multi-state example. Now this case study is about Austronesian and Bantu languages, and specifically about kinship terminology denoting sibling terms. So we could think about sibling terms as having no distinctions, no related sex distinctions, such as when you say sibling, you have no idea whether your sibling is male or female. You could also have one opposite sex distinction, such as brother and sister, what we have in English, for instance. So you hear the term and you understand what the sex or gender of the person is. And in some languages, by hearing a specific kinship term denoting siblings, you can also learn the gender of the speaker. So if I had a sibling and if I were referring to the sibling, you could understand their gender and you could also infer my gender simply from that word. And here, using multi-state method, the author is able to reveal which diachronic processes are unlikely and which diachronic processes were happening throughout the history of Bantu and Austronesian languages, which also happened to be different between these 2 language families. Now, our next method within Bayes traits, namely discrete one, this is used when we want to explore the coevolution between 2 binary traits. So what is coevolution? Now take a look at this lovely illustration of hummingbirds. If you pay attention to their beaks, you will discover that they are quite different in shapes and sizes. And you may also have a hunch that they didn't develop all those different kinds of beaks just to stand out from the crowd. In fact, the reason for those for that variety of beaks was the coevolution between the shapes and sizes of the beaks on the one hand and shapes and sizes of the preferred flowers of the hummingbird species. So you can imagine that this hummingbird prefers quite different flowers than this one. And coevolution refers precisely to that, to the relationship between two traits whereby the changes in one trait are triggered by changes in another one and vice versa. So how can we test for coevolution with the help of base traits? Well, all we needed to do is to fit one independent model and one dependent model and statistically evaluate which fit our data best. Was it the one where both traits were developing completely independently, or was it the model where the traits in one, where the changes in one trait were influenced by what was happening and how this other trait was changing? Now, let's again return to that political complexity trait. Now we have to reduce it to a binary state, meaning we are now focusing on just societies with either low political complexity or societies with high political complexity. And in this next case study, that binary trait was combined with another one, namely having or not having a moralizing high guard in Austronesian languages. And here again, we are facing different diachronic scenarios, which were more probable, which were less probable, and the ones that didn't happen at all throughout history. To give you an example of the application of discrete method, let's explore the correlations of word order features. So in typological literature, two very prominent patterns are proposed, namely languages with the order of verb object. This is what you're already familiar from that poll that you participated in. These kinds of languages are said to be also the ones that have prepositions. So languages would put small words like in, out, of before the nouns that they refer to. And also languages that have the reverse order, namely object verb, they would usually also have postpositions, meaning that in would go after the house. So the expectation, again, would be that the majority of languages are either combining two red values or two blue values. And in this next case study, you can see that once the data is mapped to the tree, indeed, it seems to be true that those expectations are met. Namely, we have a lot of red languages or a lot of blue languages. However, what is unclear by looking at this map, or even if we looked at the geographical map and not a tree here, we wouldn't be able to infer the specific diachrony of the relationships. We wouldn't understand what causes what. Here again, phylogenetic comparative methods can give you an idea about the specific diachronic scenarios that were going on behind the scenes throughout this whole time. So here, for instance, you see how we got here to these two very widespread combinations of traits in Indo-European languages, again, which transitions were common, which transitions were not common. And the final method within base traits that I will be talking about today is the continuous one. This is also focused on coevolution, but this time it takes coevolution between two continuous traits. So our two continuous traits here are the amounts of grammatical marking on nominal words and grammatical marking on verbs. And as you can see, those are indeed two continuous traits. Now we can fit dependent and independent models of evolution, and we find out that, in fact, these two traits are co-evolving throughout time. And at least in 14 Sino-Tibetan languages, we can see that this co-evolution can be characterized by positive correlation. So when nominal words gain more grammatical marking, it's quite likely that verbs will be behaving in the same way. Or when verbs lose grammatical marking, it's likely that the same will happen to nominal verbs. Nominal words. And finally, phylogenetic path analysis allows us to analyze several variables of different types and compare causal models. So imagine you're interested in 3 traits and you want to understand how exactly we arrived to where we are now, what exactly caused the current distributions of the features. And you fit several causal models, and the phyla path analysis, it can help you establish which model or models fit your data best. And on top of that, you also get to see correlation, regression coefficients, and compare which paths, which diachronic scenarios were just stronger, and which were positive and which were negative. Right, so much for our toolkit. If you're curious for more, of course, you can also combine one binary and one continuous variable. You can also control not only for genealogical relationships, but also for geographic non-independence. And today, as Annika already emphasized, we are barely scratching the surface. So I talk today primarily about this specific method of correlated evolution in the majority of case studies. And there is still a lot to explore, a lot to learn about if you feel that those are the methods that would fit best the questions that you're asking. And at this point, I would like to thank you for your attention and encourage you to ask the questions. Annika, Nataliia, and I will be happy to answer them.